Hallo? Ja, hallo? Funktioniert, ne?
So good evening, everybody. Uh, as it's a tradition at this house, I'm going to start saying some words in French and German before we proceed to our tonight's event, which will be held in English. So, nous sommes très heureux de recevoir ce soir Jorge Chaloub dans le cadre du projet Alexander von Humboldt. Du projet Alexander von Humboldt Paradox of Emancipation, basé au Centre Marc Bloch et à l'Université de São Paulo, et co-dirigé par Oliver Precht et moi-même. Je tiens tout d'abord à exprimer notre gratitude au Centre Marc Bloch et au ZFL, le Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturwissenschaft, et plus particulièrement au programme Bereich Theoriegeschichte, pour avoir rendu possible l'événement d'aujourd'hui. Nos remerciements vont également à Camille Collot pour son aide dans l'organisation logistique de l'événement d'aujourd'hui. Wir freuen uns sehr, Jorge Chaloub heute Abend im Rahmen des Alexander von Humboldt-Projekts Paradox of Emancipation begrüßen zu dürfen, das am Centre Marc Bloch und an der Universität de São Paulo angesiedelt ist und von Oliver Precht und mir gemeinsam geleitet wird. Zunächst möchte ich dem Centre Marc Bloch und dem ZFL, dem Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturwissenschaft, insbesondere dem Programmbereich Theoriegeschichte, unseren Dank aussprechen für die Möglichkeit, die heutige Veranstaltung zu ermöglichen. Unser Dank gilt auch Camille Collot für seine Hilfe bei der logistischen Organisation der heutigen Veranstaltung. So, third round. We are delighted to welcome everybody at tonight's event with Jorge Chaloub as part of the Paradox of Emancipation project and Alexander von Humboldt initiative hosted by the Centre Marc Bloch and Universidade de São Paulo and jointly coordinated by Oliver Precht and myself. I would like to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Centre Marc Bloch and the ZFL, das Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturwissenschaft, with particular thanks to the Programmbereich Theoriegeschichte for making today's event possible. Additionally, our gratitude extends to Camille Collot for his assistance with the logistical organization of tonight's event. Before we turn our attention to our guests, Oliver and I would like to set the stage by sharing some background information about our project and the research we've been conducting. Our goal is to shed light on how Jorge's presentation aligns with our broader initiative. In 2021, I had the privilege of co-auditing the book Democracy and Brazil, Collapse and Regression with Jorge, Patrícia Rangel, and Frida Rotto-Wolff, published by Routledge. This piece of work was an initial attempt to probe into the recent crisis in Brazilian democracy, extending from 2016 to the 2016 impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, to the commencement of Jair Bolsonaro's presidency following the 2018 presidential elections. These events are considered in the light of the post-democracy framework. In our introduction to the volume, Jorge, Patrícia, and I navigated this topic using the concept of de-democratization. We developed this idea to enhance our understanding of not only the attacks on Brazil's new republic, founded in 1985, following the end of the military dictatorship, but also the assault on the 1988 Constitution and the societal imaginary from which it originated and which, at the same time, it sought to strengthen. I foresee that a considerable portion of our conversation tonight will resonate with these explorations we conduct in 2021. As part of the ongoing Paradox of Emancipation project, our primary focus lies in examining epistemic issues linked to the crisis engulfing contemporary democracy. This research is grounded in a critical exploration of the post-truth perspective, which highlights the emergence of new technologies and behaviors, along with the ascendance of extreme right-wing movements posing threats to representative democracies worldwide. This line of thought characterizes post-truth as a landscape marked by the widespread dissemination of disinformation and psychological phenomena such as manipulation, conspiracy theories, and cognitive dissonance. Illustrations of these disturbing repercussions include the 2021 Capitol attack in Washington, D.C., and the 2023 assault on the Three Powers Plaza in Brasilia. As we engage in this discourse, our aim is to simultaneously question the presumption of a direct link between democracy and knowledge. Instead, we propose to study one, the dualistic roles, emancipatory and authoritarian, that knowledge can assume within a society. Two, the extent to which democracy is dependent on meta-epistemic elements like culture, imagination, and emotions, and their interrelation with knowledge. And three, how the diversification of our comprehension of knowledge might enhance the collective democratic experience in today's societies. In our inaugural event last November, a panel discussion held at the Santo Marco Bloch, we explored the project's themes by delving into the complex roles of knowledge in societies shaped by colonial and post-colonial rule. The event featured Iracema Dooley from ICI Berlin and Isadora Mota from Princeton University, whose work offers interesting insights in the interplay between knowledge, democracy, and emancipation. This discussion deepened our understanding of education's dual potential to foster and undermine emancipation, highlighting the need to reassess knowledge production in varying contexts and in connection with political struggles. Also last year, as part of our collective project, we were delighted to host Thiago Dias from the Universidade de São Paulo for a research stay. Throughout his stay, we immersed ourselves in his investigation into how social media facilitated the rise and structure of Bolsonarism in recent years, which notably influenced the outcome of the 2018 presidential elections in Brazil. Intriguingly, Thiago was keen to examine the seeming contradiction between the public invisibility and digital visibility of Bolsonarism during the elections. He concurs with researchers such as Letícia Cesarino, holding the belief that the digital activism of Bolsonaro supporters significantly swayed the 2018 election results. Finally, at the conference we organized at the Universidade de São Paulo between March 2nd and 3rd, we gathered a diverse group of scholars, primarily from Brazil and Germany, to unravel the complexities that all emancipatory projects face in this post-truth era. The conference was aptly titled Between Democracy and Authoritarianism, the Ambivalences of Knowledge. Against the backdrop I have been describing, discussions primarily focus on the perception of knowledge and its effects on the democratic process. The conversation spotlighted the role of theory and its relation with truth, arguing that these are not just external tools, but are intrinsically entwined within the problems they seek to illuminate. As such, it was posited that theory needs to acknowledge its inherent involvement within the problem itself. This realization propelled the discourse towards the need for a new form of politics, one that's processual, dialogical, and situational. I give the floor to Oliver.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. Thank you all for coming. I try to be very brief. Just want to say a few words about the Brazilian context and why we think it is especially interesting for the kind of broader philosophical questions that our project is concerned with. Ever since the end of the last military dictatorship, but especially since the Workers' Party took power in 2002-2003, Brazil was generally considered to be on a good path. The democratic institutions seemed to be consolidating. The country was finally crossed off the World Hunger Map in 2014. The government invested quite heavily in education and so forth. But then, since the year 2013, when riots and protests broke out, a series of events unfolded that first led to the impeachment of then President Dilma Rousseff, followed by a rather chaotic period defined by the rigged and highly corrupt anti-corruption campaign Lava Jato, which would eventually see the meteoric rise of Jair Bolsonaro. The victory of Bolsonaro is, of course, not a completely isolated event. As Jorge will show, his success is also the product of a broader right-wing movement with its own institutions and traditions that has been fighting the Constitution of 1988 pretty much from day one. That being said, it is still important to acknowledge that something new and unprecedented was going on. The fact that a completely obscure backbencher like Bolsonaro, who was only known to a small circle of evangelical hardliners and right-wing extremists, who had basically no party support, no rhetorical talent or charisma, could rise to such popularity in such a short time and eventually defeat the candidate of the powerful Workers' Party, Fernando Haddad, is still hard to grasp. Under normal circumstances, Haddad would have won, one might think. He would have come across as way more likable, much more reasonable, and especially as way more trustworthy, not least because he was a professor of political theory. But circumstances were not normal, and it was probably the other way around. Being a professor of political theory might have been a major obstacle for him. As Bernardo already mentioned, our efforts to understand the near collapse of Brazilian democracy, and especially the complex of problems that is commonly called post-truth, a problematic word, of course, very quickly led us to realize that one of the reasons this phenomenon is so hard to grasp is because the theories we want to apply to it are in many ways entangled in it. Of course, we don't mean this in the same sense as the Brazilian far right, which often claims that certain protagonists like Adorno, Derrida, Habermas, Judith Butler have successfully conspired to take down the truth, whatever that may be. But there is nevertheless a problem with what we call the politics of theory, especially with the distinction between those who know and those who don't know, that organizes the conceptual field and the political practice of many critical theories. So in the best case, this post-truth moment forces us to revise some of the quite fundamental concepts of theory and of the emancipatory movements that were influenced by theory, like, for example, the Workers' Party. To conceptualize a different type of politics that doesn't rely so much on the paradigm of Erziehung is quite a big and difficult project. We certainly don't think that we can just invent this new politics in this project. Instead, we try to rediscover certain attempts and traditions of reversing this paradigm in European philosophy, in indigenous thought, and in educational projects like that of Paulo Freire, who is something like the intellectual enemy number one of the radical right in Brazil. In any case, whatever new or old concepts we might eventually want to advance to reverse the post-truth dynamics, it's important not to forget that any such attempt, especially in Brazil, will be under constant attack. The far right in Brazil has a very radical and explicit agenda against any kind of critical theory, and even more so, against all empowering practices of education. Especially in Brazil, a new politics of theory will have to reckon with the extremely hostile politics of the far right. Unfortunately, there won't be much room for innocent experiments. In any case, it's very important to know the enemy, and that brings me to our guest today, Jorge Chaloub, who will take on the difficult task of giving us a more adequate picture of the Brazilian far right, which is especially tricky as most of its agents and institutions are pretty much unknown outside of Brazil. As opposed to most representations in German and more generally in Western media, Jorge will present the far right as a complex, multifaceted field. The original idea was that he will also talk about the long and intense relationship between the Brazilian and the US-American right. This complex relationship, too, is often portrayed in a very simplified way, in which the Brazilian far right appears merely as a bad copy of its US-American counterpart. But as always, there's not enough time, so he will mainly focus on the Brazilian context. Maybe we can touch on that important issue in the discussion. Jorge Chaloub is a professor of political sciences at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has received his PhD both from the USS in Paris and the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. He has been working on the extreme right for a long time, published a range of texts on the subject. I will only mention his upcoming book, Interpretações Contemporâneas do Brasil, so in English, Contemporary Interpretations of Brazil, not to be confused with his already existing published article, Interpretations of Contemporary Brazil. Not the same thing. In the cosmopolitan spirit of both the Centre Marc Bloch and the ZFL, we want to highlight that the English language does not assume the central role it does here in German academic context, in Brazil, I mean, and that everyone is therefore welcome to ask questions in other languages. We will figure it out with the translation. In this sense, muito obrigado por ter vindo, Jorge. The stage is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. First, I would like to express my gratitude to Oliver Precht and Bernardo Bianchi for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present my research on far-right intellectuals. I look forward to a stimulating discussion. So, beginning, the existing literature on the far right often explores the connection between this political domain and the strengthening of anti-intellectualism. The far right is often seen as another stage in the ongoing degradation of the figure of public intellectuals over the last decades. In the Brazilian case, authors such as Renato Lessa, João César Castro Rocha, and Letícia Cesarino argue in this sense, considering the far right, considering the far right or here's fine. It's better. Oh, sorry. Consider the far right or Bolsonarism a concept they all problematically take as a synonym, as opposed to, or at least dissonant with, a certain idea of reason identified with modernity. The far right has, in this sense, destruction as its main and almost exclusive goal in an argument that sometimes illustrated by a famous statement recorded on video by Jair Bolsonaro, still in the first months of government in Washington, in which he says, Brazil is not an open ground where we intend to build things for our people. We have to deconstruct a lot of things, to undo a lot of things, and then start doing things again. Undeniably, part of the success of the far right is a rhetorical of radical criticism of the present and even of a certain past that is considered conventional, which in another text I called the rhetoric of the scorched earth. The field has also one of its most important arguments, the idea of an intellectual hegemony of the left in institutionalized intellectual space, such as the university or the traditional press, which would be terrains exclusively dominated by the left. There is, however, more complexity in these questions than this initial scenario suggests. Not only the figure of the intellectual, with traces of continuity and others of rupture, central to the far-right field, but the public use of the arguments that claim to be intellectually sophisticated has been central to the growing intellectual and political influence of the far right. The idea of a natural divorce between the far right and the intellectual misses fundamental aspects of the political and intellectual performances of contemporary politics, both inside and outside Brazil. I would go further and say that to radically oppose the ultra-rights and intellectuals mean losing sight of crucial transformations, of the figure of the intellectual. The far right also feeds on the limits and proposes ways of expanding the public sphere, even if, of course, this expansion produced the destruction of the democratic praxis as we know it, breaking with a certain Habermasian assumption that directly relates the expansion of the public sphere to democratization process. The argument that the far-right intellectual is anti-intellectual is usually related, therefore, to a normative concept of intellectual, which somehow relates it to the expansion of democratic practice and, after all, to the enlightenment in the Kantian sense of the public sphere. In this sense, we will take a different approach to understand how intellectual figures and practice have influenced the development of the far-right movement. This analysis aims to deepen our comprehension of this field and shed light on the ongoing Brazilian democratic crisis, despite some positive developments following the 2022 election. Additionally, exploring these far-right actors can provide insights into the contemporary whole of intellectuals. Before examining these arguments, it is important to clarify the relationship between the concepts of far right and Bolsonarism, a term commonly used when discussing contemporary Brazil. Some sources treat these two concepts as interchangeable, reinforcing the perception of an inherently anti-intellectual far right. Similarly, this argument can be extended to another prominent far right leader, Donald Trump, who shares strong similarities with Bolsonaro, but also exhibits notable difference. I believe that a similar argument can be made in relation to another leader of the far right field. So let's begin with Bolsonarism. At first glance, it appears similar to other concepts that aim to connect various political practices with the institutionalization of charismatic leadership to Brazil and Latin America history. Examples of such terms include Peronism, Varguism, Lulism, Gaullism, Trumpism, and many others. One common aspect among these concepts is the central role of the leader, even though their public representations extend far beyond the actions of any specific historical figure. These concepts also exhibit a certain distinction between the physical person exerting leadership and the movements mobilized under their name or associated symbols. In this case of Bolsonarism, it is deeply entangled with Bolsonaro himself, yet it also acquires a degree of relative autonomy and establishes a network of political actors who organize themselves around the president's name but not are entirely under his control. The internet plays a central role in the institutionalization of Bolsonarism. Unlike other examples mentioned, Bolsonarism doesn't rely on traditional structures like political parties, established social movements, newspapers, radio, or television. Instead, it thrives on a virtual form of institutionality, where various social networks serve as the primary mechanism for constructing new forms of charismatic routinization. On one hand, Bolsonarism follows the regularities typically associated with an institutionalization process. It connects political leadership to certain standards and subjects it to the demands of allies. However, on the other hand, it connects the chaotic nature stemming from the dispersed and decentralized dimension of the internet. This occasionally disorients opponents, but also comes with costs in political competition, as it was evident in 2022 elections in Brazil. The inability to exercise effective control over voters and activists creates a dynamic more akin to fascism, characterized by constant mobilization of supporters that sometimes exceeds the leadership control and bureaucratic structures. It diverges from the form, for example, of bureaucratic authoritarianism, such as those observed during the Brazilian military dictatorship, which lasted from 1964 to 1985. However, Bolsonarism should not be mistaken with the overall process of constructing the far right in Brazil, even though it is a crucial factor for its successful trajectory. When Bolsonaro emerged as a prominent figure in Brazilian politics, he entered a political field that already claimed a radical public identity to the right of the mainstream right wing. This political space was shaped by the continuous efforts of politicians, intellectuals, businessmen, and various actors who effectively occupy influential positions in the mainstream media. They played a significant role in building institutions and dominating the public discourse in Brazil. These actors contributed to the field to new proposals and ideas, presenting what they perceived as a genuine right wing perspective absent from Brazilian history. They also launched constant attacks against perceived enemies and adversaries, particularly targeting the Workers' Party and the left. However, these attacks also extended to the political order established after the country's redemocratization, the 1998 constitution, as Oliver and Bernardo already mentioned. While Bolsonarism occupies a privileged position with these fields and has intensified its growth, it represents only a part of a broader scenario. To comprehend this political movement fully, it's essential to consider the global context, where far-right parties have gained strength in recent decades, and leaders who aim to change the established liberal order and prevailed after the Soviet era have emerged. Many of its figures, including Trump and Orban in Hungary, share striking similarities in terms of their style with Bolsonaro. However, the Brazilian case exhibits certain specificities that stem from our social formation and peripheral status. Here, the primary objective of these actors, at least initially, is the dismantling of our democratic regime, which was established after a prolonged military dictatorship. This objective unites them despite their inherent differences and set the boundaries of the far right field. According to far right narrative, the Brazilian democratic regime is portrayed as a political experiment marred by the left subversion of true national values, straying from the inherently conservative nature of the Brazilian population. It is characterized by a pervasive corruption of both the state and the society. It is important to note it within these discourses that corruption is perceived as a profound process that signifies the complete degeneration of society and the nation, with the misappropriation of public funds being just one aspect of it. This rhetoric, which I characterize, as I already say, scorched earth rhetoric, takes on various forms. Sometimes it portrays Brazilian history solely in a negative light, while at other times it traces the origins of evil to more recent historical periods. This rhetoric serves as a binding force for a heterogeneous coalition comprising reactionaries, libertarians, fascists, and segments of traditional right-wing movements. They also share a critical stance towards a vague nation of the left, frequently equating it with communists and other times with the 1988 Republic. The political strength of this group and the process of normalization of the far right is partly the result of the naturalization of a discourse deeply critical of the Brazilian political order, hegemonic in most of the mainstream media, and greatly strengthened during the Workers' Party governments. The Brazilian democratic order began to be regularly portrayed in major newspapers, television networks, and radio stations to the lens of endemic corruption, the inept nature of the states, and the bad fate of politicians, which created over more than a decade of continuous reiteration of this narrative a public desire for a radical break with Brazilian existing democracy. Part of this feeling is due to the limits of the political experience itself and the failure of the promises of a certain redemocratization, but not only. The representations of Lava Jato, that Oliver already mentioned, a political movement led by judges and prosecutors, which is very similar to Italy's Operation Manipuliti, Clean Hands, in much of the media, is particularly didactic evidence to demonstrate the strengths and resilience of the aforementioned discourse. However, it's important to note that the current democratic crisis in Brazil is not solely a result of the emergence of the far right. On one hand, the crisis is partially rooted in a longer process of discrediting institutions and discrediting the new Brazilian Republic. On the other hand, the far-right movement experienced significant growth during the Lula administration between 2003 and 2010, a period characterized by strong optimism about Brazilian democracy. It's crucial to recognize that there is a distinction between these phenomena, but the distinction does not imply in a lack of relationship between them. The far right is an opportunist actor that sees the crisis as an opportunity to establish its influence within the Brazilian political discourse. Simultaneously, it plays a central role in deepening the critical situation. While it can be asserted that the democratic crisis predates the preeminence of the far rights, it is noteworthy that the critical juncture not only fosters the growth of such actors, but also positions these groups as crucial agents in intensifying and consolidating the crisis as the new normality. Bolsonarism, which is a faction of the far right centered about Bolsonaro and characterized by the use of fascist political language, has been particularly effective in leveraging this scenario, taking the lead in polls and in the streets, at least until the current moment. Conceptual distinctions are not only valuable for gaining a deeper understanding of the past, but also for envisioning potential future scenarios. The distinctions between the far right and Bolsonarism allow us to contemplate a situation in which the far right continues to be a significant force in Brazilian politics, given its electoral and grassroots support, without necessarily relying on leaders from the Bolsonaro family. By recognizing this difference, we can envision a future where the broader far-right movement maintains its position as one of the main poles in Brazilian politics, potentially with new leaders emerging. These scenarios imply a potential shift in far-right leadership. Bolsonaro is characterized by its strong mobilization of fascist political language, as I already say, undoubtedly harbors a distrust on intellectuals. And then I begin with the main theme of my presentation. And any discourse that relies on reason. However, even the former president itself, Bolsonaro, utilized the image of Olavo de Carvalho, a far-right intellectual who gained significant popularity in the past decade, particularly during the early stages of his government. In his victory speech, Bolsonaro prominently displayed two books, the Bible and the successful work by Olavo de Carvalho titled Everything You Need to Know Not to Be an Idiot, a collection of concise texts. Nevertheless, the far right extends beyond Bolsonarism, and its political language encompasses more than just fascism. Within the far right field, there are at least two other political languages that I call ultraliberalism and reactionarism. Both of these ideologies assign great importance to the whole of intellectuals. However, each of these political languages envisions its own distinct idea type of intellectual, which will further be explored in the following discussion. Before delving into the discussion of specific far-right intellectuals, it is crucial to establish certain defining characteristics that bind them together. They find their cohesion in the idea of the enemy, but they also share certain family resemblances in the sense given by Wittgenstein. It is worth noting that some of the characteristics exhibited by far-right intellectuals were not recently imported for the North American discourse. Instead, they can be traced back to the post-war era, with notable figures of the Brazilian right distinguishing it from the far right in this case, such as Carlos Lacerda, Roberto Campos, and Paulo Francis. These continuities, are not limited to ideological perspectives, but also extend to the aesthetic techniques employed in constructing their public personas. The first is the critical dimension of any idea of a social system built on reason. Some consider the main spokespersons of this political language as anti-intellectuals because of their asystemic dimension of their thinking, which rejects an idea of a system of thought. We are not only facing the rejection of big theories that are presenting their ideas But we are dealing with authors who dispense the idea of internal coherence and constantly attribute totalitarian features to the theoretical systems, almost always referring to a vague notion of leftism, communism, or socialism. The three more frequent languages of the far right, reactionarism, ultraliberalism, and fascism, have, for different reasons, a refusal of the ideas of system and totality. Reactionaries, conjugated by authors such as Olavo de Carvalho, as I already said, refuses any idea of system because it refers to the meaning of political ideas and practice to a radical religious transcendence. Ultraliberalism, on the other hand, bases its anti-systemic dimension on a radical individualism, which takes any construction of the common as an authoritarian intervention in individual liberties. Finally, fascism refuses the intellectual dimension to the apology of violent action and instinct, which would reveal a true absence from the pretensions of reconstructing reality through thought. The refusal of any coherent dimensions does not imply, at least in ultraliberalism, the importance of ideas, which is sometimes suggested by the conception of anti-intellectualism, but rather their insertion in a different dynamic, in which performance and rhetorical forms has as much importance as content, and coherence is given by the idea of enemy, who is clearly identifiable. A second characteristic of the aforementioned right-wing intellectuals is a self-image that positions them outside the hegemonic political world. This is a word against which they direct their criticism, a criticism as radical as its alleged alien to the establishment. The relationship between their radicalism and their contempt for the centers of power translates into a rhetoric described in the public debates under the term of anti-system. It should not be forgotten, however, that this is largely a construction supported by rhetorical devices. Undoubtedly, there's a renewal of characters and the emergence of new protagonists. However, their position in relation to the establishment is not one of total separation. It involves, in many instances, longer relationships with economic, media, and military elites. The construction of a site of discourse external to the dominant order, whose representation often has conspiratorial traits, is fundamental to the strength and the eloquence of its critique. This makes more credible those discourses and practices that claim their novelty and propose a radical rupture with the supposed establishment. Such a stance of radical change in society, in turn, prevents them from claiming similarity to the Mannheim intelligentsia, which places itself as a mediator and organizer of the various interests and confrontations that permeate society by virtue of its ability to transcend them. A third characteristic of its discourse of access is the discourse of access to a truth that at the same time is unknown and self-evident. There are frequent references to a famous passage from the Gospel of John. The passage is, then you will know the truth, and the truth will be set you free. According to this discourse, it is due to the left, which is preventing the access of most of the population to the knowledge of social reality, that certain ideas are not widely known. For this discourse, it is important that a direct relationship between truth and morality is established, in such a way that both the moral virtue and the right is directly related to a privileged access to the truth, and the intellectual degeneration of the left is directly related to its moral decline. The far-right intellectual would thus be the one who would reveal to the people what they are, but sometimes do not know they are, due to an articulation between the political elites and the left-wing intellectuals. The ostensible claim of belonging to the right does not, however, make these intellectuals assume their link to classes or interest groups. Following the famous Gramscian dichotomy, it is as if they are organic intellectuals who refuse the identity of organic intellectuals in favor of an image of traditional intellectuals. Needless to say, there is a deep affinity between this discourse and conspiracy theories, a trait of the right wing of the 50s and 60s that finds clear continuity in the contemporary manifestations of the far right. Conspiracy theories presume the same privileged possession of the truth. Likewise, they portray those who do not agree with their ideas as complicit or naive. There are great continuities in the form of conspiracy theories before and after social media. Richard Hofstadter's classical book, written in 1964, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, accurately describes some of the current far-right activist styles. Finally, a common trait of these intellectuals is the constant use of an aggressive rhetoric, with heavy attacks on opponents. Speeches vary between the solemn tone of someone who speaks urgent truths and the frequent use of humor and irony, which seeks to portray those who speak as superior in spirit and intellect to their adversaries. Aggressiveness and humor are always ways of revealing the supposedly false character of the political world, and thereby laying down the ground rules of the typical venues for discussion in the traditional public sphere, such as the press, books, and parliament, among others. Some of these performances are directly inspired by the culture of certain social media platforms, but it is not a one-way movement where only intellectuals are affected by the networks. The social networks have popularized the practice of functions directly identify with the figure of the intellectual, such as the expression of opinions of major issues on the public sphere and the construction of taste in Bourdieu's sense of the words, in which the intellectual takes on the whole of mediating the consumption of culture goods by the individual. It should be noted, however, that not all influencers are intellectuals, since this requires the construction of the legitimacy based on knowledge, which is absent in most popular profiles. An interesting team developed by some authors inside and outside Brazil, such as Letícia Cesarino, Shoshana Zuboff, and Paulo Garbaldo, often experts in the dynamics of contemporary social networks, is a possible affinity between network architecture and certain far-right discourses. With regard to the figure of the intellectual, this would lead us to the instigating question. Have the networks deepened the crisis of the model of the critical intellectual that's more affectionate to the left, which, according to authors such as Enzo Traverso, has already entered into the decadence in the post-Soviet era, and have created then a propitious terrain for hegemony of the right and perhaps of the far right in the public debate? Unfortunately, I don't have the answers, but I believe that this is a fundamental research agenda, not only for the intellectual work as researchers, but also for the political landscape of the coming years. Even if the performance in the social networks are central to those who dispute the contemporary intellectual field, I would like to emphasize what has already been suggested in my presentation. The social networks intensify some discourses and popularize others, suggest themes and behaviors, but there are profound continuities of arguments, performances, and political language that make it difficult to defend the idea of social networks as pure novelty. Social networks produce new forms of circulation and production of discourses, which have enormous consequences for politics, but do not completely break with important ideological traditions of modernity. I believe that the novelty of the far right in contemporary public debate is so more aesthetic than argumentative. It's important to say that they do not separate aesthetics from politics. Here or use a concept of discourse limited to the written word. But I only seek to emphasize that if there are new arrangements of ideas and concepts in the contemporary far right, there are much less new given the broad of continuity of old political language. There are much less new construction of political language, as I say. After suggesting general traits of the far-right intellectual, it is time to discuss some distinctions. I think it is possible to state that the predominance of each of the political language of the far right indicates an archetype. Those who cultivate reactionaries usually construct an aesthetics that refers in part to the conservative Anglo-Saxon intellectual, but above all to the post-war resection in North America of the idea of the English conservative man of letters, cultivated by figures talking about North America like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver. Olavo de Carvalho is a strionic version of this character that is also cultivated by other authors, such as, yeah, you probably don't know them, but even the Brazilian probably don't know many of them, as Martin Vazquez da Cunha, Bruno Garchagen, among others. All representatives of an intellectual field that seeks to combine reactionarism and conservatism as ways of distinguishing itself from supposedly progressive hegemony. The aesthetic construction often starts with the clothes, with recourse to certain types of suits popular in England or in the United States in the 50s and 60s, sometimes continues with instruments uncommon in today's Brazil, such as the pipe, and arrives at the vocabulary, linguistic and theoretical. They need to use words that distinguish them and combine them with the more direct language used in the internet, what produces a hybrid vocabulary, which moves quickly from the popular to the use of classical authors. Such intellectuals do not pretend to be modern or in tune with the latest news, but rather to construct a conscious anachronistic image as a way of assuming the whole of bearers of a lost tradition. The ultra-liberal intellectuals, who sometimes call themselves libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, or even refers themselves as classical liberals, are also directly influenced by the US-American context, drawing either on the reception of Austrian neoliberalism after 1945 or in the tradition of libertarianism after the 60s. They, however, do not present themselves as representatives of tradition, but uh, put themselves as trying to bring the future and insert Brazil into modernity. Unlike in the United States, in Brazil, there is not a strong imaginary of the entrepreneurial individual who built the nation. So the ultra-liberal intellectuals are very distant from many topics of the conservatives. They do not resort to a spatial concept of history, which, as Mannheim points out, places present and future in the same space, or build their intellectual and political legitimacy on tradition, but distinctively, they show themselves as agents of the new. According to their narrative, Brazil did not have any kind of liberal tradition, since statism and socialism would always have predominated in the country. Therefore, it is necessary to invent liberalism through radical political action. The political aesthetics of libertarians is thus that of the successful businessman or the young entrepreneur. They usually use a direct language, refer to symbols and pop icons, and draft in clothes usually identifying Brazil with the upper classes, since the emulation of personal wealth is seen as a virtue of merit and a sign that their voice should be heard in the public debates. Meanwhile, there is no distinction between the virtues of the markets and the states. Even those who are older always speak to appear as young and healthy in an aesthetic that emulates the coastal cities of the southern United States, especially those of Florida and California. The aforementioned pop language emerges to the mobilization of language of memes from the social networks, the recording of videos with performances and reference to contemporary movies and music. Good examples are the uses, close to the American far right, of the red pill metaphor, inspired in the film Matrix, or the protest performances against art exhibitions supposedly identified with the left. Intellectuals such as Kim Kataguri, Eli Beltrão, Luis Felipe Dávila, among others, fall into this category. All are intellectuals strongly identify with libertarianism, which in Brazil emerges as a mark of the new. We speak in both cases of ideal types, which evidently have a higher degree of generality and abstraction than the analysis of a particular intellectual would suggest. As a way of illustrate some of these characteristics, traits in Brazilian ultra-right intellectuals, I want to take a closer look at the most famous figure of the last decade, the most famous far-right intellectual of Brazilian politics, that is Olavo de Carvalho. So I begin the last part of my presentation, Olavo de Carvalho, a case study. Olavo de Carvalho is a character that helps to expose different aspects of this field. Even if it is wrong to take him as the only voice, as an isolated protagonist, or as representative of all the tendencies of the far-right field, he undoubtedly condenses many of the elements that define, in the eyes of the general public, not only the idea of far-right intellectual, but the very concept of intellectual in contemporary Brazil. The growing popularity of Olavo de Carvalho is supported, among other factors, by three key elements. The first one, the popularization of a deep sense of political and social crisis, which gains strength especially after 2016, but has been cultivated since the 2000s and naturalized in the public debate to the Workers' Party's governments. The second one, his ability to adapt his rhetoric to different media and wide circulation, from the press to the YouTube videos, through his skillful mobilization of social networks. The third one, his accurate bets based on interpretation of the conjuncture on particular style of aggressive rhetoric, marked by a radical criticism of the left and of Brazilian history, and by the attack of a series of historically subaltern groups that are gaining increasing space in the public debate. The social networks proved to be a fertile ground for his rhetoric, which was nourished by the construction of constant opposition, always organizing the debate as a clash between friends and enemies. Alongside conspiracy theories, the aggressive and disloyal style against opponents and former allies increased Olavo's fame and reinforced his ability to mobilize followers and detractors, which in turn not only influenced the most specific discussions, but defined the very way in which the general public debate took place. The strategy of talking notorious absurds, like claiming that the earth is flat or challenging Newton's physics, was a way not only to occupy the center of intellectual disputes, but also to define their limits. His ability to record easy videos and create sorry. Sorry. I lost myself here. The claim of the novelty. His ability to record easy videos and create easy phrases gave him, on the other hand, the rule and the compass to achieve most of his goals. The way he composed his speeches found, in turn, a great echo in social networks. The constant articulation between scholarly arguments and often crudely handled and everyday language, including the extensive use of swear words, managed to captivate the many who wanted to find a new intellectual repertoire. The use of erudite references reinforced the intellectual authority of the professor in a process that not only sanctioned his radical critiques of the world, but also attribute to him a privileged knowledge of reality. The construction of an alleged banned canon, supposedly ignored by the dominant intelligentsia, reinforced the character of the supposed brilliant intellectual and created a complicity between students and their master, all of them considering themselves members of a group that share truths ignored or even actively hidden by all the others. To attract more students, Olavo de Carvalho promised quick access to all these ideas. The path was tempting to many who could distinguish themselves from their surroundings and access a theory that explained by conspiracies Chris the most diverse aspects of reality. In, in times of vertiginous increase in the amount of information and great specialization, the author offered a general explanation that articulated the supposed misery of Brazilian reality to a great narrative that intended to expose not only the hidden truths of the world geopolitical scenario, but also the derailments of the modern project itself. The language, full of silly words, as I already said, in turn, reinforced the image of a thinker who has the truth on the tip of the tongue, fearless of the described life as it is, and made him close to the students, as someone who spoke deep truths to them as if they were at the eye level. The construction of this feeling of intimacy was reinforced by the choice of his first name, Olavo, as the most popular way of spreading his image and was complemented by the environment of the videos, where the professor's own house, uh, between a puff and a sip of drink, he emulated a personal atmosphere. The atmosphere extended to the place where his viewers consumed their videos, their homes, where they received the professors as another illustrious guest. The normalization of the discourse is strongly critical to the left, and the amplification of the impact of social networks paved the way for the popularity of Olavo de Carvalho, who knew how to read the paths opened by new times. His accusations of authors sometimes reproduced the cancel culture of social networks by mentioning details of the personal lives of authors like Rousseau and Marx to supposedly destroy their works. However, as much as the author is undeniably a leader of the far right field, one cannot ignore that he is a part of a broader movement. His trajectory would be impossible without the great openness of the mainstream media to far-right intellectuals in Brazil, the creating of an editorial vein of activists for the same camp, and the successful performance of think tanks before political elites. Alongside other public intellectuals, many of them equipped with somewhat diverse intellectual influences and styles, Olavo embodied the character or radical ultra-right critic of the system, which greatly contributes to already long and deep the Brazilian democratic crisis. It should be noted that while Olavo de Carvalho, breaks with traditional patterns of intellectual image, he assumes other facets of this social rule, such as the function of constructing a certain taste, both aesthetic and intellectual, and of mediating access to knowledge, indication paths to knowledge of works, authors, and themes. This new type of intellection would not only present himself as a misunderstood prophet, as the revealer of a truth hidden in the past and only glimpsed by him, but also as a missionary, capable of revealing aspects of the reality supposedly hidden by the power, dominated in his narrative by the hegemonic left. Olavo de Carvalho claimed concomitantly the role of a pedagogue and a representative of a silent conservative majority. And I'll just quote just one speak of Olavo de Carvalho and just really close to the end for you to see part of his rhetoric. He says, I quote, "The absolute majority of Brazilian, especially young people, is massively conservative electorate, deprived of political representation, of entry into the intellectual debates, and of space in the mainstream media," Carvalho says. "It is a marginalized people expelled from the public scene by those who promises to open the doors of democracy and participation." And he does construct, and now I'm saying, an ambiguous character, a difficult composition between the educated intellectual and the spokesman of the people. His discourse found its audience in a country living through severe, a really tough democratic crisis and erosion of previous, almost consensual elements of the 1988 constitutions. That's the base of our recently democratic pact. Social media were his privileged medium, but his trajectory would not have followed the same paths without the aid of links to the intellectual and political elites. From being a poster character in demonstration for impeachment against President Dilma Rousseff to the whole of decorative literature in Jair Bolsonaro's victory speech, Olavo de Carvalho saw a rise in popularity and gained influence in the public debate. Even though he exercised undeniable influence in sectors of the government, it's important to say that Olavo de Carvalho was not the official ideologue of the Bolsonaro government or the far-right coalition carrying his administration. A central part of this idea, very much in tune with reactionarism, diverged from the discourses and interests of most the military or of certain economic elites. There is, however, no direct opposition between Olavo de Carvalho's ideas and such groups. It is precisely the ambiguity of these thoughts, exposed by recourse to other political languages and to a non-systematic character, that is part of the reason of his popularity. I believe I have said too much and exposed the less clear scenario than I would have liked. In part, this stems from my own questions, hypotheses, and doubts about the topic and the field. It's also necessary to point out, however, that this is not only a scenario of recent construction, but one that is constantly changing. If there are numerous continuities in the history of the right in Brazil, it's not possible to study the contemporary far right only from its ideas. It's fundamental to articulate ideologies to performances, taking into account the deeply aesthetic dimension of some of the innovations of the field. The more general argument of the presentation is that not only the figure of the intellectual is really important to contemporary far right, which requires a particular caution with the concept of anti-intellectualism, but also that the contemporary far right is fundamental, but also that the idea of intellectual is fundamental to the same idea of the contemporary far right. Understanding the current culture contours of the figure of the intellectual and the public debate is a key element in defending democracy in the years ahead. Understanding what exists is, in this sense, more interesting than reiterating a discourse of absence and decadence of the true intellectual. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe we take a deep breath and then we open the floor to questions. We have maybe like 25 minutes roughly. Yes. Shall we use the mic or can you try to take this one? Well, if there are no immediate questions from the audience, I have quite a wide range of questions. One of the things that I'm really curious about, for example, is the relationship, because that is going to be the next big topic at the ZFL, the relationship of the right-wing intellectuals to activism in science. Because right-wing activism is not only and always against science. They are, of course, and largely and famously against the humanities, which Bolsonaro, for example, wants to openly, completely abolish. But they're not necessarily against science. Maybe quite on the contrary, they make frequent use of scientific or pseudo-scientific arguments. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that science arguments are really important to part of this far right. I think that even when they critique science or when they critique, I don't know, policies of the universities, they sometimes critique more in I don't know, a culture war against science than denying science at all. Taking an example, when Olavo de Carvalho he criticizes Newton, he doesn't say that physics is important. He says that he really know what's the, I don't know, the real physics. Really know what's the real science. That's different from the science that's discussed in the university. So sometimes he critiques more the institutional face of science than science itself, I think. So the idea, I think that in recently years, not only in Brazil, but also in the North American literature, that was, we used to have a wide use of the concept of negationism, of the anti-intellectualism. I think we have to be more cautious about that, because of course, there is that phase in the far right thoughts in Brazil, and not only in Brazil. But I want to also emphasize that sometimes there's not a direct critique against the idea of intellectual, or a direct critique against the idea of science, but rather, I don't know, a dispute over the sense of science and over the sense of intellectual. And that's important, not only in the, I don't know, in the academic discussion, because for us it's obviously that when Olavo de Carvalho, or when, I don't know, Murray Hofbauer in the United States criticize some aspects of teaching science in universities, they are not making, I don't know, serious science, but to the way people, common people who are not here today discussing with us, see science and see the whole of intellectuals. For them, this kind of discourse even is not precise when you think in academic patterns. Is really, I don't know, is really has deep consequences to the way people see science, the way people see the humanities, as Oliver had said, the way people see the university. And I want to also emphasize, as Oliver says, that many times the problem is not only against science, but against the humanities. So it's a really common discourse that the humanities are not the true science. Even these intellectuals and these activists, many times they came from the human sciences, but they want to say, oh, I came from the human sciences, but I know, since I have been in the university, that nobody that has been teaching in the university is really serious, is really strict, is really coherent. So this kind of discourse is really common in the far right speech, in the intellectuals, and also in the activists.
We have a question here and a question over there.
Yes, thank you very much for your intriguing talk. I don't know anything about Brazil, but listening to your talk and what you thought about right-wing intellectuals and this overall phenomenon, I thought many things, mostly everything one could say also about the Northern American US situation. And listening to you, I asked myself, what is the specific, or is it really a global phenomenon? Even this Christian background we have and also this corrupted state, corrupted democracy. So there were very many notions you highlighted, also your case studies that could have been similar, quite similar career in the US context. So would you say it's really a global phenomenon, or is there nevertheless a specific Brazilian constellation with differences? I would be curious, not knowing anything.
Thank you very much for your question. That's really interesting. I think that one specific aspect is the whole of liberalism in Brazil. I think that's a specific aspect. I think that the way liberalism is constructed in Brazilian scenario in Brazilian discussion is different from the United States. And the idea of the whole of the liberalism, and people want to claim, they claim themselves as liberals in Brazil, a part of Brazilian far rights. That's really different, not only from the United States, but also if you think at Orban's or Putin, for example. So that's a really interesting difference. Also, I would say that in Brazil, the whole of tradition to these far rights is different, because that's why libertarianism, for example, in the US is often seen as a branch of conservative thought. But in Brazil, that doesn't work, because in Brazil, the idea that Brazil is a scorched earth, in Brazil, the idea that we haven't produced anything in 500 years is really common. And so it's really common, something that I didn't have time to say, a certain use of a geopolitical imaginary. So conservatives in Brazil claims that Brazil is a part of the Western world, and that Brazil is a part of a Christian idea of the Western world. So this idea is really, I don't know, it's not the same as America, because the use of nationalism in rhetoric is also different. But in this presentation, I want to I don't know, I wasn't really worried to show the specificities of the Brazilian case. Of course, I was also worried about that, but I want to show from the Brazilian case how the importance of this idea of intellectual of the far right, because I think that's really common in the discussion of international literature, that people used to tell, oh, the far right is, of course, it denies the idea of the intellectual. I think it's not the idea of intellectual. I think it's a certain idea of the university. I think it's a certain idea of progressive intellectual, idea of the intellectual that's really, I don't know, that's really in the center of certain idea of enlightenment. So I want to discuss that, but trying to to answer in a really brief way, I think that are the main specificities: the whole of liberalism, the whole tradition, a certain geopolitical imaginary, and I also think that are I don't know, that's a really long discussion, but there are a certain whole of intellectuals, I don't know, in peripheral countries. That is also a discussion that's really interesting, because there's kind of an idea that you can dialogue with Gramsci, for example, the idea that intellectuals, they not have only to, I don't know, organize the civil society, but they have also to develop the country. So it's like that the whole of intellectuals in Brazil is really common to say that they have to bring a new future to Brazil. So I think this whole that used to be really related to the left in recent years is really important to understand Brazilian far right and to understand the whole of intellectuals in the Brazilian far right.
Thank you. Come to us. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions. One is more methodological, and the other one perhaps political. I like very much the parameters that you insert into your discourse analysis, the aesthetic dimension. And I was wondering whether you also consider perhaps another category in that of emotions, the emotional sort of, what we call manipulation and the use. The other question is whether you think that your methodology applied to less than universalist sections of the so-called left in politics, left-wing activist groups that are less than progressive, but nonetheless call themselves left, would perhaps similarly shed a challenging light on so-called left-wing intellectualism. Is that something that is specific to the right, or is that something that's more applicable, more broadly?
Thank you very much. They're excellent questions. The first question, to look at the politics of emotion that many authors use to study not only the right but contemporary politics. I think it's a really interesting path. I didn't do that today, but I try to do. Actually, I try to, but I try to think about, I don't know, the manipulation of emotions, using this idea of political language that I try to develop. I not develop specifically in the text, but I try to develop in my research. So, and the idea of political language is that don't want to link one political language with one actor. So I want to say, so the neo-Pentecostals, the evangelical politics in Brazil, they are conservatives. I want to show how they sometimes use some anarcho-capitalist arguments, and sometimes they use reactionary arguments. And all this idea, this lack of internal coherence is possible because they really criticize the idea of any system of thought. From this, parting from this, I try to make a debate about the use of emotions, but I'm still developing that. I try to, I'm starting to write that in the text that I'm starting to write about the idea, the whole idea of languages. I wrote many articles, but I was developing this kind of methodological or main theoretical article that I'm trying to end in the next months. And the idea of emotional mobilization, of a political of emotion, I think is really important to that. So, but I don't, just to develop that, I don't really agree, because there are certain uses of political emotion that says, because the far right's dialogues, especially with fear, for example, there are certain uses. I think that we have to be really careful of these uses, because if when I do some empirical work, when I did some interviews with Bolsonaro electors and with Professor Raquel Lima that's here, we saw that there wasn't only fear. Of course, it was fear of losing, I don't know, their place in society, of losing sometimes of the importance, if we think as themes as gender, race, and class, and other types of inequalities. But also, I think that this kind of, I don't know, politics of emotion of the far right always dialogues with a certain idea of utopia. So they always give a certain idea of future. So I don't think that the only I don't know, emotion that mobilizes the emotion of fear of lost something, but they also show, and they also construct a certain idea of creating a new future. And then I go to the left, that I think that many times in the post-Soviet era, the left can't give that. The idea that the left can give the same idea of a radical breakdown with the past. And in the global south, in peripheral countries like Brazil, that's really important, because Brazil is a really deep and equal society. So it's really hard to succeed in politics saying that, we are keeping what we are doing is really fine. And even when the Workers' Party government really achieved some impressive things, I think it's really hard to say that, because many people really live in really deep poverty. So this idea of future And this idea of utopia that came from the far right, I think, is a really important emotion. And talking about the left intellectuals, I think that's not only looking at the Brazilian scene, but also looking to the North American scene that I try to see. Many times you see some kind of performances, some rhetoric, some use of the social networks that's really similar. But I think that's it's a hard thing, because I don't like to use the idea, oh, in the end they are all the same. I'm not saying that, but I say that look to the far right intellectuals. On one hand, it's interesting to me to better understand the far right, starting with the Brazilian case. But also it's interesting to me because I think that it almost shows some questions about the contemporary idea of intellectual. That maybe the contemporary idea of intellectual has to use, thinking about this, an idea that the intellectual isn't the specialist, intellectual isn't the academic, isn't the professor, is someone who puts the thoughts and their ideas to some political consequences in society. So thinking about that, maybe we have to look at that contemporary concept of intellectual, taken and with a special attention to the whole social networks. I'm not saying here that we don't need to have any critical look of the social networks. But as we see today, who succeeds in being a successful public intellectual, the whole of public of social networks is really central. And many times, sometimes of language of the social networks make left-wing intellectuals really close to right-wing intellectuals, and that's a problem. And we have to discuss that. And that's like, I think that's an agenda that I like to develop, but I'm still in the beginning of these ideas, of this question and hypothesis.
Thank you so much. I cannot agree more with your non-normative conception of intellectual, but I think it's very good to have that. And I was wondering if you could say about if you think that this right-wing intellectual is an anti-universalist, but you mentioned the anti-systematic way of thinking and the absence of systematic thinking, but would you also say it's an anti-universalist thinking, which is a characteristic of that? And how does Christianity and the, let's say, implications of universality fit with this concept of the far right in Brazil or in general?
Thank you very much for the question. I don't think they are anti-universalists. I think, for example, when you think about reactionarism as a political language, as I say, reactionarism talks a lot, is really influenced with universalistic ideas, but is like at the same time is an universalist idea, but it's not a systematic idea, and it seems really bizarre because we are used to relate an idea system to an idea to a universal explication of the world. But why isn't systematic but is universalistic? Because there is, especially in the reactionary language, but also in parts of other languages, an idea that the truth don't come from reason, but come from something beyond. And many times that thing beyond is a religious way of thought. So the idea of faith, the idea of a deep transcendence, transcendental thoughts that really gives sense and gives coherence to something that if you only look at the I don't know, at the human themes and the human disputes, we can see this kind of coherence. So there was a recent book from a North American author about Dugin, about Olavo de Carvalho, and about the intellectual really close to Trump, Steve Bannon, sorry. And to Steve Bannon, he wrote about it, and he tried to I don't know, to conceptualize them as traditionalists. They are saying that they were really influenced by authors such as René Guénon, such as Julius Evola, authors that are not really read today, but has some kind of mystical way of seeing the world. But I think that's it's not only that. I think that and especially when I look to Brazil, and that I know better in Brazil, there are certain continuities with a kind of an idea of reactionary intellectual of Brazil, an intellectual that has criticized, for example, all the modernization of the church after the 60s. Intellectual that was really worried about the growing of left in Catholic Church in South America. So this kind of dispute is really present. But was that an author as Olavo de Carvalho, or authors as others, as, for example, Ernesto Araújo, who is important because he used to be the chancellor of Brazil in Bolsonaro government. They are really universalistic. They say Ernesto Araújo has wrote a text that's so-called Trump and the Western. And he wrote, oh, Trump can save the Western. But Trump can save the Western not because of the idea of the US as a leader of the capitalism of the liberal world. He saw Trump as the leader of the Christian world. So as a leader of the Christian world, Trump can fight against modernity, can fight against secularization, and can create a new idea of universal thoughts, but a universal thought that doesn't relate it purely to reason, but it's related most to faith. It's really bizarre, but that's really dialogues not only to certain intellectuals, but that really dialogue to the major whole of the Catholic Church or of the evangelical churches in Brazil. So it's really it's not that these people read directly these authors, but this kind of produces in social networks lots of arguments, lots of performance, lots of ideas that circulates and that really are central to a kind of dispute in Brazilian society.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for your talk. And I was just wondering, for one side, how much you talk about a lot of U.S. America influences and Bannon, etc., and Christian identitarians. And I was wondering if you could shed a little bit of light with the influences between the intellectual far right in Brazil, de Carvalho, with the European intellectual far right. I'm thinking about the French Nouvelle Droite. If there is something that you may tell us. And on the other side, I was wondering if how much on integralism, of these ideas of the fascist era of Pino Salgado are in Bolsonarism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent question also.
Sorry, can I just ask if there is a last question, because and then we close for tonight? Okay. Is there? Okay. And then we make
Fine.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, now this comes a bit suddenly, so I haven't really prepared how to get into this question. It's not a simple question. I think it's mainly a question about one specificity of Brazil, which is, I guess, its unique position vis-a-vis climate change with the Amazon, and the kind of absurdity that, in a sense, it's even a huge economic potential of blackmailing the rest of the world, right? But this cannot happen because ultimately this would hurt the interest of a certain system and network of people who exploit this resource, and ultimately it would mean to shift economically to the nation in a sense, and this cannot happen. So there's a matter of the weakness of the state, right? That seems quite significant, and I wonder whether that's something that also has an impact on the role of the intellectual and what it actually means, because in a sense it's also quite shambolic of it, right? So there's this aspect of it that yeah. So I just wonder how you see that issue. Thanks.
Fine, thank you. So I answer to both questions. Talking about the relation between Brazilian far right and Europe, I think that's on one hand we can talk about Bolsonarism, about Bolsonaro. Né? Bolsonaro tried to become especially close in the political scenario, a more institutional political scenario, especially to Matteo Salvini in Italy. I think Matteo Salvini was his main, his main ally in European politics, more than if we think about Front National, for example, for instance. So I think that Salvini is more important because I think that if we think about the Le Pen in France, I think that they don't want to make the idea of an international group of the far right as Salvini, as Trump, as Orban, and as Bolsonaro like to do. I think that there are recent changes in France far right that don't make them as much close as they could be. Thinking about the Nouvelle Droite in France, I think that it's possible to say about influences in Brazilian political thoughts, in the history of Brazilian political thoughts, that on the does influence the discussion of recent far right. But I don't think there's a direct influence. So I don't think the idea of the Nouvelle Droite is really important for contemporary far right in Brazil. But I think the Nouvelle Droite is important for the history of far right in Brazil, and the history of far right in Brazil is important to contemporary right in Brazil. I don't know if I make myself clear, but there are some influence, but I think it's not a direct influence. And I would say the ask for integralism is a really interesting question, because the main words of Bolsonaro's campaign are words that came directly from integralism. And if you read, for example, the discourse when the discourse of Ernesto Araújo, for instance, and even sometimes the discourse of Olavo de Carvalho is many times present some arguments, some ideas of integralism. But I think that when you think at the whole of integralism, I think it's not the central whole. I think they really influence some intellectuals. I think they really influence some parts of these people, but I think that they really have to fight with other languages of the far right. So that are sometimes more central than integralism. So it's important, but it's not, I don't know, as some researchers may say, the key to understand Bolsonaro. I don't agree with that. But it's important. And also, because an idea that's really important is that after the Second World War, President Salgado wasn't a really important person of Brazilian politics. And even recent personality like Enéas, who used to be a really popular candidate to Brazilian presidency, with he wasn't really central and really important in main political disputes in Brazil. So I think that integralismo has to be treated as something that's important to some intellectuals, but not as to be as the past of the present far right. Present, especially. But also, I think that integralism has, I don't know, he's really influenced some new fascist groups. So there are new fascist groups that always act in Brazil, but they're really little. They are not really central to Brazilian far right today. I think they are terrible for Brazilian democracy, but I think the main problems, there are two. First, when emerges a new far right, new actors that they are related to the integralist tradition, but they are not directly representatives of integralism. And when most of teams and most of ideas of this far right become really common to Brazilian main rights that used to dispute the elections against the Workers' Party. So I think that's when you saw the recent elections in Brazil after 2010, we start to see that the hegemonic right uses teams that in the whole world are seen as teams of the far right. Like the way they discuss the abortion issue, for example, the way they defend some kind of punitive, a really violent action of the state. So this kind of discourses, I think, is more important when you talk about that. So, and talking about the Amazon is really interesting because I may say that the main point of relation between the military institutions in Brazil and the far right in Brazil has the environmental discussion in the center, because military in Brazil, they not really reactionary. They sometimes have some kind of an authoritarian conservatism. But they are really worried about Amazonia. They really has this kind of conspiracy theories that the whole world wants to take Amazonia from Brazil. And you can say, oh, no, but you are just talking about a really secondary military leader. No. I'm talking about Eduardo Vilas-Boas. Eduardo Vilas-Boas used to be the chief of Brazilian army, used to be a main person in Bolsonaro's government. He has a really bad disease now, but he has given a long interview to a really important Brazilian anthropologist. And this main interview, he says things like, oh, but the Amazonia has, and the ONGs in the whole world want to take Amazonia from Brazil, and they are really close from this racial discourse, is that precisely, and from this feminist discourse that wants to break with Brazilian tradition of belonging to a Christian Western. So this idea is kind of bizarre because I don't know, in the liberal discourse here, in the progressive discourse, we think, oh no, it's central to the Western today that we really fight for preserving the Amazon forest. But in the discourse of the military in Brazil and of the far right in Brazil is different. The idea of the Amazon forest, the Amazon forest is a place where culture wars take place, because the environmental discourse is only a branch of culture wars, as the race discourse are, as the feminist discourse are, and this really, I don't know, this really make the army in Brazil sympathetic to far-right arguments. And that's not only a problem in the public discussion, but that's a problem for the institutions of Brazilian democracy. So it's a main problem. Thank you for the question.
So thank you all for being here tonight. And now we are going to have a moment for a little socialization. Thank you.
Demorou quanto tempo?
A sua fala em si? Acho que, não sei, uns 45 minutos. Né? Foi. Acho que foi uns 45 minutos.